The iron plates clanged against each other with metallic precision as Arnold Schwarzenegger completed his final set of bench presses at Gold's Gym Venice Beach, the sweat glistening on his massive frame under the California afternoon sun streaming through the skylights. March 22, 1982. Al Pacino stood near the posing mirror, wrapping his hands with athletic tape as he prepared for what his trainer had assured him would be essential physical conditioning for his upcoming role in Scarface. At 42, he understood that Tony Montana required not just psychological intensity but physical credibility, and Gold's Gym was where serious actors came when they needed to build authentic muscle for demanding roles. But what happened in the next 6 seconds would prove that some kinds of strength couldn't be measured in pounds lifted or muscle mass gained. Gold's Gym was the Vatican of bodybuilding, a temple where the world's most dedicated physical specimens came to worship at the altar of iron and discipline. The walls were covered with photographs of champions, Mr. Olympia winners, powerlifting record holders, and the occasional Hollywood action star who'd earned their place among the muscle elite through years of dedicated training rather than movie contracts and publicity stunts. Arnold dominated this space like a king surveying his kingdom. At 34, he was no longer competing professionally, but his 7 Mr. Olympia titles and legendary status as the Austrian Oak made him the undisputed authority on everything related to physical development and masculine achievement. When Arnold spoke about strength, training, or what it meant to be a man, even the most accomplished bodybuilders listened with religious attention. Al had been training at Gold's for 3 weeks, working with former Mr. Universe Frank Zane to develop the kind of physique that would make Tony Montana's violence believable on screen. His approach was typically methodical, studying not just the physical movements but the psychology of men who built their identity around physical dominance, learning how muscle development affected confidence, aggression, and the particular brand of masculinity that intimidated other men through presence alone. But in a gym full of men who measured success in bench press numbers and bicep circumferences, Al's analytical approach to physical training made him stand out for all the wrong reasons. Pacino. Arnold's voice boomed across the gym floor, his thick Austrian accent cutting through the ambient noise of clanging weights and heavy breathing. "Come here. I want to talk with you." The gym went quiet as every serious lifter understood they were about to witness something significant. Arnold didn't casually summon people for conversations. When the Austrian Oak wanted to speak with someone, it usually meant he had observations to share about their training, their dedication, or their understanding of what serious physical development required. Al walked across the rubber matting with measured steps, his movement controlled but carrying none of the muscle-bound swagger that most Gold's Gym regulars had developed through years of lifting heavy weights and admiring their reflections in the mirror. "Al Pacino," Arnold said, his pale eyes studying the actor with the analytical attention of someone who'd spent decades evaluating physiques and the men who built them. "The movie star." "Arnold," Al replied respectfully, extending his hand to the legendary bodybuilder. Arnold's handshake was crushing, not out of malice but from the casual strength of someone whose grip had been forged through years of deadlifts and barbell rows. When he released Al's hand, his expression carried the slight condescension that serious athletes often showed toward people they considered dilettantes. "I have been watching you train these past weeks," Arnold said, his voice carrying the particular authority that came from being the most successful bodybuilder in history. "You and Frank, working on your preparation for this movie role." Al waited, sensing that Arnold was building towards something larger than casual gym conversation. "And I have to say," Arnold continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering judgment, "I am curious about this whole acting business." Several nearby bodybuilders moved closer, recognizing that Arnold was about to deliver one of his famous observations about the difference between real achievement and Hollywood pretense. "You see," Arnold said, his voice gaining strength, "in bodybuilding, in real physical development, there are no tricks. No camera angles, no stunt doubles, no special effects. Just a man, iron, and the will to push beyond what most people think is possible." The implicit criticism was clear. Arnold was drawing a line between authentic physical achievement and the kind of manufactured toughness that movies required. "But acting," Arnold continued, his gaze focusing directly on Al, "acting is pretending, yes? You pretend to be tough, you pretend to be strong, you pretend to be dangerous. But it is all performance. Al remained perfectly still, his breathing controlled, his expression unchanged. But everyone present could sense that something was building beneath his composed exterior. "And this concerns me," Arnold said, his voice taking on the earnest tone of someone genuinely worried about cultural decline, because young men watch these movies, and they think that acting tough is the same as being tough. They think that looking strong is the same as being strong. Arnold gestured around the gym, taking in the serious lifters who'd stopped their workouts to listen. "But real men," Arnold said, his voice carrying absolute conviction, "real men don't act. They don't pretend. They build real strength, real discipline, real achievement. They prove themselves through actual accomplishment, not through performance." The word performance carried obvious dismissal, reducing Al's entire career to the level of elaborate pretense. "Real men don't act," Arnold repeated, his pale eyes fixed on Al's face. "They do. They achieve. They build something real that cannot be faked or performed or acted." The silence that followed was electric and dangerous. Arnold Schwarzenegger had just publicly questioned not only Al's profession but his fundamental masculinity, in front of the most serious physical athletes in America. When Al finally responded, his words would prove that Arnold's definition of real men was about to be challenged in ways the Austrian Oak had never imagined. When Al finally responded, his words would prove that Arnold's definition of real men was about to be challenged in ways the Austrian Oak had never imagined. The silence in Gold's Gym stretched beyond what the serious lifters were accustomed to experiencing during their training sessions. Al remained motionless, his dark eyes focused on Arnold's massive frame with an intensity that seemed to make every piece of equipment in the gym fade into background noise. When he finally broke his silence, his voice carried a quality that made every bodybuilder present stop their workouts completely. "Arnold," Al said quietly, his voice carrying the controlled power that had made him famous, "you want to know what real men do?" Arnold nodded, perhaps expecting a defensive explanation about the importance of acting or the challenges of Hollywood performance. "Real men face the parts of themselves that most people spend their entire lives avoiding," Al said, his voice taking on the passionate intensity that had defined his greatest performances. "They explore psychological territories that would break weaker minds. They risk their sanity to understand human darkness that most people can't even acknowledge exists." The gym was completely quiet now, every serious athlete understanding that Al's response was heading somewhere none of them had anticipated. "You talk about real strength, real discipline, real achievement," Al continued, his voice gaining power with each word. "But let me tell you what real strength looks like, Arnold. Real strength is spending 2 years learning what it costs a man psychologically to choose family loyalty over personal morality." Al stepped closer to Arnold, his movement controlled but carrying an undercurrent of building energy that made several bodybuilders shift uncomfortably despite their own physical dominance. "When I prepared to play Michael Corleone," Al said, his voice building with controlled intensity, "I didn't just put on a suit and practice looking tough. I explored what happens when good men make evil choices for reasons they can justify. I learned what it means to sacrifice your own humanity to protect the people you love." Arnold's confident expression began to flicker, perhaps sensing that this wasn't the defensive response he'd expected from someone he'd just publicly dismissed. "That's not pretending, Arnold," Al said, his voice taking on an edge that made everyone present suddenly more alert. "That's psychological archaeology. Digging into parts of human nature that most people never have to face because they're protected by comfortable lives and simple moral choices." Al looked around the gym, taking in faces that included some of the most physically powerful men in America, all of them watching with fascination as he systematically dismantled Arnold's critique. "You want to know what method acting really requires?" Al asked, his voice gaining strength. "It requires the willingness to risk your psychological stability to find authentic human truth. It requires functioning at maximum emotional capacity while exploring experiences that could destroy your mental health if you're not strong enough to handle them." The devastation was building, but Al was just getting started. When I prepared to play Frank Serpico, Al continued, his voice taking on the passionate conviction that had made him legendary, I didn't just wear a police uniform and practice looking honest. I rode with undercover narcotics officers in Bedford-Stuyvesant at 3 in the morning, watching them risk their lives to protect communities that sometimes hated them for trying. Arnold remained perfectly still, his legendary composure beginning to show cracks as Al continued his systematic dismantling of everything the Austrian Oak thought he understood about strength and masculinity. I learned what it means to be the only clean cop in a corrupt precinct, Al said, his voice building with intensity. To choose integrity when corruption is easier, safer, and more profitable. To risk everything for principles that most people only talk about while they're safely removed from real consequences. Al stepped even closer to Arnold, close enough that everyone watching understood this had moved beyond polite disagreement into something more fundamental and dangerous. That's not acting, Arnold, Al said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. That's tougher than any weight you've ever lifted. Because when you lift weights, you know exactly how much resistance you're facing. When you explore human psychology, you never know if you'll be strong enough to come back from where the character takes you. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Arnold Schwarzenegger, the man who defined physical achievement for an entire generation, stood speechless as Al continued his education in what authentic strength actually required. But you want to know what really separates real men from people who just look tough? Al asked, his voice taking on a new quality that commanded absolute attention from every person in Gold's Gym. Arnold nodded, though his earlier confidence had completely evaporated. Real men don't just build their bodies, Al said, his voice gaining power. They build their capacity to understand and endure psychological experiences that would break people who only know physical challenges. Al's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow carried more devastating power than any shout could have managed. Because physical strength has limits, Arnold, Al said, his words cutting through the gym's silence like surgical instruments. You can only lift so much weight, build so much muscle, achieve so much physical dominance. But psychological strength, the ability to explore human darkness and come back stronger, that's unlimited. Arnold stood completely still, his pale eyes showing something that the serious lifters around him had never seen before, genuine uncertainty about his own understanding of strength and masculinity. When you say real men don't act, Al continued, his voice returning to respectful tones while maintaining its underlying steel, you're confusing performance with exploration. Performance is safe, predictable, controlled. What I do, what real actors do, is psychological exploration that requires more courage than any physical challenge you've ever attempted. Al straightened his training shirt with deliberate care, his movement controlled and dignified. Because anyone can build muscle if they're willing to lift weights consistently, Al said, delivering what would become the most quoted response in Gold's Gym history. But it takes real strength, psychological strength that you can't see in a mirror or measure with a barbell. To explore what ordinary people become when pushed beyond their moral limits. The silence that followed lasted nearly a full minute before Arnold extended his massive hand to Al. Al, Arnold said, his voice carrying none of its earlier condescension, I think I may have misunderstood what your work requires. Al shook Arnold's hand firmly, his grip respectful but not deferential. Arnold, I learned everything I know about discipline from watching athletes like you, Al replied. But I hope you understand now that discipline comes in different forms. Physical discipline builds the body. Psychological discipline builds the capacity to explore human truth that most people never have to face. The handshake lasted several seconds, everyone present understanding that they'd witnessed something unprecedented, not a victory of one approach over another, but a recognition that strength existed in forms that even the most accomplished athletes had never considered. You know, Arnold said, his voice thoughtful rather than challenging, I have always wondered what it takes mentally to become completely different people for movies. Maybe this requires more than I understood. It requires everything you've learned about discipline and focus, Al replied, but applied to psychological territory instead of physical territory. The dedication is the same. The risk is just different. Word of the confrontation spread through the bodybuilding community within days, not as gossip about a celebrity argument, but as a lesson in respecting different forms of strength and dedication. Arnold never again made dismissive comments about acting, and privately told training partners that his encounter with Al Pacino had taught him to respect psychological preparation as much as physical preparation. The story became legend among serious actors and athletes alike, cited as proof that authentic strength could exist in forms that weren't visible to the naked eye, and that real achievement, whether physical or psychological, deserved recognition from anyone serious about pushing human limits. Al continued training at Gold's for his Tony Montana preparation, but the dynamic had shifted completely. The serious bodybuilders who'd initially viewed him as a Hollywood dilettante now watched his workouts with genuine respect, understanding that his approach to character development required the same kind of dedication they brought to their physical transformation, just applied to psychological territory they'd never explored. Arnold and Al became unlikely mutual admirers, each recognizing that the other's commitment to their craft, whether building muscle or building characters, represented the kind of total dedication that separated professionals from amateurs, regardless of whether the results were visible in a mirror or on a movie screen. Years later, when Arnold transitioned into acting himself, he would privately credit his conversation with Al Pacino as the moment he learned to respect the psychological preparation that great performances required. And the moment he understood that real men didn't just act or just do, but explored every dimension of human strength available to them.